The moment my mother told me, "You're being selfish. Family is supposed to help family," I realized something was terribly wrong. Not because she was angry, not because she was disappointed, but because she was saying those words while standing in my living room, demanding that I quit my weekend plans so my brother and his wife could leave town without their children. What none of them knew was that within a few months, their years of treating me like a free babysitting service would completely backfire. The same family members who expected me to drop everything whenever they called would eventually find themselves standing in front of dozens of people, trying desperately to explain why they had lied about me. By then, however, it would be far too late. My name is Victoria Harper. I'm 38 years old, single, child-free, and according to my family, apparently available 24 hours a day. At least that's how they treated me. Looking back, I should have recognized the pattern much earlier. The problem wasn't that I loved my nieces and nephews. I did. The problem was that everyone around me assumed that because I didn't have children of my own, my time somehow belonged to them. My younger brother Daniel and his wife Melissa had 3 children under the age of 10. They were good kids. Energetic, sometimes difficult, but good kids. I enjoyed spending time with them. Unfortunately, my family gradually transformed that enjoyment into an expectation. At first, it seemed harmless. Daniel would call and ask whether I could watch the children for a few hours while he attended a meeting. Melissa would need help during a doctor's appointment. My parents occasionally needed assistance transporting the kids somewhere. None of those requests seemed unreasonable individually. The problem was that they never stopped. Over time, those occasional favors became weekly responsibilities. Then they became assumed responsibilities. Eventually, nobody even asked anymore. They simply informed me. I would receive text messages saying things like, "Dropping the kids off at 3, or need you Saturday morning." Not, "Are you available?" Not, "Would you mind helping?" Just instructions. Somewhere along the way, my role in the family quietly shifted from sister and aunt to unpaid childcare provider. For years, I tolerated it because saying no felt selfish. Every time I tried establishing boundaries, someone found a way to make me feel guilty. My mother was especially talented at this. Whenever I hesitated, she would remind me how important family was. She would talk about sacrifice and responsibility and supporting one another. What she never mentioned was that support only seemed to travel in one direction. Nobody adjusted their schedule for me. Nobody canceled plans when I needed help. Nobody offered compensation or even much appreciation. They simply expected me to continue being available. The situation became so normal that even Daniel's children started assuming I would always be there. If Melissa wanted a weekend away, I watched the kids. If Daniel worked late, I watched the kids. If both of them wanted a vacation, I watched the kids. Sometimes entire weekends disappeared without anyone asking whether I had plans of my own. Things finally started changing the year I accepted a promotion at work. I managed operations for a regional marketing company, and the new position required additional responsibilities. It also came with better pay, which allowed me to pursue interests I had postponed for years. I joined hiking groups. I began traveling occasionally. I started building a life that wasn't centered entirely around everyone else's emergencies. At first, my family pretended to support these changes. Then they began resenting them. Every time I wasn't available, someone made a comment. Every trip became evidence that I cared more about myself than family. Every personal achievement somehow turned into criticisms. The tension continued building until one Friday afternoon, when Daniel called asking me to watch the children for an entire weekend, because he and Melissa had booked a last-minute getaway. Unfortunately for them, I already had plans, important plans. I was leaving early Saturday morning for a hiking retreat I had paid for months earlier. When I politely declined, the silence on the phone lasted several seconds. Daniel's voice immediately changed. "Seriously?" I explained the situation calmly. His response shocked me. "You know, Melissa and I already booked everything." I reminded him that nobody had asked me beforehand. Instead of understanding, he became angry. By the end of the conversation, he accused me of abandoning the family An hour later, my mother called, then my father called, then Melissa sent messages. By evening, multiple relatives were contacting me. Suddenly, I wasn't simply unavailable for one weekend. I was selfish, unreliable, disappointing. The pressure became so intense that I briefly considered canceling my trip. Then something happened that changed everything. While scrolling through social media later that night, I discovered a post Melissa had accidentally made public. It wasn't intended for me. It was a conversation between her and a friend. In the message, she joked about how they never needed to hire babysitters because Victoria always says yes eventually. The comment was followed by laughing emojis. As I stared at the screen, something inside me finally snapped, because for the first time, I realized the truth. They didn't appreciate my help. They expected it, and the moment I stopped providing it, they weren't treating me like family, they were treating me like an employee who had refused to work. What I didn't know then was that this small argument was about to trigger a chain of events that would expose years of manipulation and force my entire family to confront a truth they desperately wanted to avoid. The next morning, I left for the hiking retreat exactly as planned. For the first time in years, I ignored every guilt-inducing message, every passive-aggressive comment, and every attempt to pressure me into changing my mind. The drive into the mountains felt strangely liberating. My phone continued buzzing throughout the morning, but I refused to check it. For 2 days, I focused entirely on myself. I spent time outdoors, met new people, and enjoyed something that had become increasingly rare in my life: peace. Yet even hundreds of miles away, my family's drama managed to follow me. Late Saturday evening, curiosity finally got the better of me. I opened my phone and immediately regretted it. There were dozens of missed calls and messages. Some came from Daniel. Others came from Melissa. Several came from my parents. The tone of those messages varied from frustration to outright anger. According to them, my refusal to babysit had created a disaster. Melissa complained that they had lost money canceling their trip. Daniel accused me of embarrassing him in front of his wife. My mother claimed the children were upset because their aunt didn't care about them anymore. Reading those messages felt surreal. Nobody mentioned the fact that I had simply said no to one weekend after years of helping. Instead, they acted as though I had committed some terrible betrayal. By Sunday evening, I realized something important. The problem wasn't my decision. The problem was that I had finally made a decision they couldn't control. When I returned home Monday morning, the situation became even worse. My mother arrived at my apartment unannounced. The moment I opened the door, I could tell she wasn't there for a conversation. She was there for a confrontation. She immediately launched into a speech about responsibility, family values, and sacrifice. For nearly 20 minutes, she spoke without allowing me to respond. Every sentence painted Daniel and Melissa as victims. Every argument focused on their struggles. Not once did she acknowledge my perspective. Finally, I interrupted her. I calmly explained how often I had helped over the years. I reminded her about the birthdays I missed, the vacations I postponed, and the weekends I sacrificed. I described the countless occasions when everyone simply assumed I would be available. Instead of listening, she dismissed everything. According to her, those sacrifices were exactly what family members were supposed to do. That response hurt more than I expected. Because, in that moment, I realized she genuinely believed my time mattered less than everyone else's. No matter how much I gave, it would never be enough. The expectations would simply continue growing. The argument ended badly. My mother left angry, and within hours the rest of the family had heard her version of events. Suddenly, relatives who hadn't spoken to me in months were contacting me with opinions about my behavior. Some encouraged me to apologize. Others suggested I was overreacting. A few implied that my independence had made me selfish. What frustrated me most was that none of them knew the full story. They only knew what Daniel and Melissa wanted them to know. For years, I had protected my family's image by staying silent. Whenever someone took advantage of me, I ignored it. Whenever I felt hurt, I kept it private. That's how silence allowed a false narrative to develop. Everyone believed I occasionally helped my brother. nobody realized I had practically become a second parent whenever it was convenient for him. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that staying quiet had only made the problem worse. A week later, another incident pushed me over the edge. I was attending a community fundraiser when I overheard two women discussing Daniel and Melissa. At first, I wasn't paying attention. Then I heard my name. One of the women mentioned how generous my brother was for handling childcare responsibilities, despite having an unreliable sister. I nearly dropped my drink. Curious and confused, I listened more closely. What I heard left me stunned. Somehow, Daniel and Melissa had convinced multiple people that I frequently agreed to watch the children, and then canceled at the last minute. According to their version of events, they were constantly forced to rearrange their lives because I couldn't be trusted. The lie was so outrageous that I struggled to process it. Not only were they angry that I had finally set boundaries, but they were actively rewriting history to make themselves look like victims. Worse, people were believing them. That night, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing years of old messages. At first, I was simply looking for reassurance that I wasn't imagining things. Then I noticed something interesting. Nearly every conversation followed the same pattern. Daniel or Melissa would inform me they needed childcare. I would agree. Occasionally, I would rearrange important plans to help them. In many cases, they thanked me briefly, before immediately asking for another favor. As I continued scrolling, I discovered dozens of examples proving exactly how dependent they had become on my help. There were screenshots, dates, requests, entire conversations documenting years of expectations. More importantly, there wasn't a single example supporting the story they were telling people. Not one. The evidence completely contradicted their claims. For the first time, I realized I wasn't powerless. The truth existed in black and white. I had proof. 3 days later, everything came to a head. My parents hosted a family dinner and insisted everyone attend. I almost declined. Then I learned that several extended relatives would be there as well. Something told me this gathering wasn't about family. It was about pressure. The moment I arrived, I sensed the tension. Conversation stopped when I entered the room. Relatives exchanged awkward glances. Daniel and Melissa avoided eye contact entirely. It quickly became obvious that people had been discussing me long before I arrived. For most of the evening, I remained quiet. Then, during dessert, my uncle casually mentioned how difficult childcare must be when family members refuse to help. The comment wasn't accidental. It was a challenge. Several heads immediately turned toward me. Suddenly, everyone wanted to hear my response. What none of them realized was that I had come prepared. Because after years of staying silent, I was finally ready to tell the truth. And once that truth came out, nothing in our family would ever be the same again. The moment my uncle made that comment about family members refusing to help, the room became unusually quiet. It was obvious that everyone expected me to defend myself, apologize, or simply sit there and accept the criticism. For years, that's exactly what I would have done. I would have smiled politely, changed the subject, and allowed everyone to continue believing whatever version of the story they preferred. But something had changed. Maybe it was the months of frustration. Maybe it was discovering the lies Daniel and Melissa had been spreading. Or maybe I was simply tired of being treated like a resource instead of a person. Whatever the reason, I calmly set down my fork, looked around the table, and asked a simple question. Before we continue this conversation, can someone tell me exactly what you've been told? The reaction was immediate. Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. My aunt finally spoke first. She explained that Daniel and Melissa had repeatedly mentioned how difficult it was to rely on me because I often agreed to babysit. And then backed out at the last minute. Another relative claimed they heard I frequently prioritized vacations and social activities over family commitments. By the time everyone finished talking, I realized the situation was even worse than I thought. The story had spread far beyond a few casual conversations. Over the past several months, Daniel and Melissa had quietly built an entire narrative, portraying themselves as exhausted parents, struggling because of an unreliable sister. The most shocking part was how many people believed it. I turned toward my brother. For a moment, our eyes met. He immediately looked away. That told me everything I needed to know. He knew exactly what he had done. The room remained silent as I pulled out my phone. Interesting, I said calmly. Because I have a slightly different version of events. My mother immediately interrupted, warning me not to create unnecessary drama. Ironically, her comment only strengthened my resolve. For years, silence had protected people who didn't deserve protection. This time, I wasn't staying quiet. I opened a folder containing screenshots I had spent days organizing. Then I began reading. One message showed Melissa informing me she would be dropping off the children on Saturday morning, without even asking whether I was available. Another showed Daniel requesting an entire weekend of childcare, because they wanted a last-minute vacation. Several messages included comments thanking me for rearranging work schedules, canceling personal plans, and sacrificing weekends to help them. As I continued reading, expressions around the table slowly changed. Confusion turned into surprise. Surprise turned into discomfort. The evidence painted a very different picture from the one Daniel and Melissa had been sharing. What made the situation even worse for them was the sheer volume of proof. This wasn't one or two examples. It was years' worth of conversations documenting exactly how dependent they had become on my help. Every request, every assumption, every expectation. The pattern was impossible to ignore. I wasn't an unreliable babysitter. I was practically unpaid childcare. The more evidence I presented, the more obvious that fact became. Several relatives began asking questions. Why had nobody mentioned how often Victoria helped? Why were there no examples supporting the claims about canceled commitments? Why did every screenshot seem to show Daniel and Melissa making demands instead of requests? The questions came faster than they could answer. For the first time, my brother looked genuinely nervous. Then came the moment that changed everything. One of my cousins asked directly whether there was any proof that I frequently backed out of babysitting commitments. Before Daniel could respond, I opened another folder. This folder contained every single conversation connected to the weekend getaway that started the conflict. The screenshots clearly showed that nobody had asked me beforehand. Daniel simply assumed I would be available. When I declined because of plans I had arranged months earlier, he immediately became angry. There was no cancellation, no broken promise, no failure to help. There was only a boundary, a perfectly reasonable boundary that they refused to respect. The room fell silent as people read the messages for themselves. Suddenly, the entire situation looked very different. My mother attempted to defend them, arguing that parenting was difficult and that mistakes had been made. Under normal circumstances, that argument might have worked. Unfortunately for her, the issue was no longer childcare. The issue was dishonesty. Several relatives openly questioned why Daniel and Melissa felt the need to exaggerate or completely invent stories about me. My aunt pointed out that nobody would have criticized them for occasionally needing help. The criticism came from how they handled my refusal. Instead of accepting one answer they didn't like, they chose to attack my character. Hearing those words from someone else felt strangely validating. For years, I had questioned myself. I wondered whether I was being unreasonable, whether I expected too much, whether saying no truly made me selfish. Watching other people recognize the manipulation confirmed what I should have realized long ago. The problem was never my boundaries. The problem was that certain people benefited from me having none. The evening ended in complete chaos. Daniel and Melissa left early after realizing they had lost control of the narrative. My mother followed shortly afterward, furious that the situation had spiraled beyond her ability to manage it. Meanwhile, several relatives remained behind apologizing for believing things that weren't true. Although their apologies meant a great deal, the damage wasn't entirely repaired. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. As I drove home that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Relief. For the first time, the truth was no longer hidden. Everyone finally understood what had really been happening. Yet deep down, I knew the story wasn't over. Public embarrassment has a way of making certain people desperate. And, judging by the messages already appearing on my phone, Daniel and Melissa weren't planning to accept responsibility. They were planning to fight back. What they didn't realize was that their next decision would ultimately create consequences far worse than anything they had experienced so far. The morning after the family dinner, I woke up to more than 30 unread messages. Some came from relatives apologizing for believing the rumors Daniel and Melissa had spread. Others came from friends who had heard about the confrontation and wanted to know what happened. The messages that mattered most, however, came from my brother and his wife. Neither message contained an apology, neither acknowledged the evidence I had presented. Instead, both focused entirely on how embarrassed they felt. According to Daniel, I had humiliated him in front of the family. Melissa accused me of deliberately trying to turn people against them. Reading those messages was almost laughable. Even after being confronted with years of proof, they still viewed themselves as victims. For a brief moment, I considered responding. Then I realized there was nothing left to say. The evidence had already spoken for itself. No explanation I offered would matter because the real issue wasn't misunderstanding. The real issue was accountability. They didn't want the truth. They wanted the version of reality that benefited them. For the first time in my life, I refused to participate in that version. Over the following weeks, the consequences of their actions became impossible for them to ignore. Several relatives who had previously helped with childcare became less willing to volunteer after learning how often Daniel and Melissa had manipulated situations. My parents also found themselves in an uncomfortable position. For years, they had pressured everyone else to support Daniel's family while rarely acknowledging the burden placed on others. Now that the truth was public, people started asking difficult questions. Why had so much responsibility been pushed onto one person? Why was helping considered an obligation instead of a favor? Why did nobody seem concerned about my time or my life? Those conversations forced my parents to confront realities they had spent years avoiding. Unfortunately, Daniel and Melissa faced an even more immediate problem. For the first time in years, they actually had to arrange childcare themselves. What they quickly discovered was that professional childcare was expensive, very expensive. The same weekends they once enjoyed for free suddenly came with significant costs. Vacations required planning. Date nights required budgeting. Last-minute trips became nearly impossible. The convenience they had taken for granted disappeared overnight. The situation reached a turning point about 2 months later. One afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call from Melissa. Initially, I assumed she wanted another argument. Instead, her voice sounded unusually nervous. She explained that one of their regular childcare arrangements had fallen through and asked whether I could help for a few hours. The request itself wasn't surprising. What surprised me was how different it sounded. For the first time, she wasn't making a demand. She was actually asking. There was no guilt, no pressure, no assumption that I would automatically agree. Just a simple request. After considering it, I agreed to help, not because I felt obligated, but because I genuinely loved my nieces and nephews. That distinction mattered. When the children arrived, I spent a wonderful afternoon with them. We baked cookies, played board games, and watched movies. As they left that evening, something became clear. My issue had never been with the children. It had always been with the entitlements surrounding them. Loving family and establishing boundaries were not mutually exclusive. In fact, healthy relationships required both. Several weeks later, another family gathering took place. This one felt very different from the previous disaster. The atmosphere was calmer. Conversations felt more genuine. Most importantly, people seemed far more respectful of one another. During dinner, my uncle quietly pulled me aside. He admitted that watching the entire situation unfold had changed his perspective on family dynamics. For years, he assumed helping relatives automatically meant saying yes. Now he understood that support given freely was very different from support expected without limits. His words stayed with me long after the evening ended. Because they perfectly captured the lesson I had spent years learning. Boundaries don't destroy families. Entitlement does. Eventually, Even Daniel began changing. The transformation wasn't immediate. And it certainly wasn't perfect, but it was noticeable. As he spent more time managing responsibilities he once delegated to others, he gained a greater appreciation for the help he had received. One evening, nearly 6 months after the confrontation, he asked if we could talk privately. We met for coffee. The conversation was awkward at first. Then, after several minutes of uncomfortable silence, he finally apologized. Not the kind of apology designed to end an argument. A real apology. He admitted that he had become accustomed to my availability and stopped appreciating the sacrifices I made. He acknowledged spreading stories that weren't fair. Most importantly, he accepted responsibility without making excuses. Hearing those words didn't magically erase the past, but it was enough to begin rebuilding trust. Looking back now, I realize the entire situation taught me something valuable. For years, I believed being a good family member meant always saying yes. I thought sacrifice automatically made relationships stronger. What I eventually learned was that constant sacrifice without respect creates resentment, not love. Healthy relationships require appreciation, honesty, and mutual consideration. They require recognizing that every person's time has value. Most of all, they require understanding that helping someone should always be a choice, never an expectation. Today, I still spend time with my nieces and nephews. I still help family members when I can. The difference is that now my help is requested, not demanded. My boundaries are respected, not criticized. And perhaps most importantly, I no longer feel guilty for having a life of my own. The irony is that the family members who once accused me of being selfish ultimately learned the same lesson I did. They discovered that support cannot be forced. Respect cannot be demanded. And people cannot be treated like resources without consequences. The day I finally stopped saying yes to everything wasn't the day I abandoned my family. It was the day I stopped abandoning myself. And in the end, that decision didn't destroy our family at all. It simply forced everyone to build healthier relationships based on truth instead of expectation. Sometimes the strongest act of love isn't giving people everything they want. Sometimes it's teaching them that your kindness should never be mistaken for an obligation.